Hey friends, I'm Ash Leatherwood, your friendly neighborhood apologist, and today we're back with another interview. We have a very special guest. I've been looking forward to this one. With me is Dr. Douglas Axe. He's a molecular biologist. He is the Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola University and is the founding director of the Biologic Institute. His work has been featured in scientific journals such as the Journal of Molecular Biology, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Biocomplexity, and Nature. Additionally, he is the author of Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thanks for coming on, Dr. Axe.
Great to be here, Ash.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of your work. Your book, Undeniable, is actually what got me interested in the argument from intelligent design to begin with. It was the first one I got my hands on. Informs me on the discussion about Neo-Darwinism and its challenges, as well as brought me to a new depth and appreciation for the world around us. I feel like it captured really well the wonder of God's creation and life, even at its most fundamental parts and components. So it's quickly become my favorite argument for the existence of God, as I think it's possibly the greatest and most personal product of his intelligence that we get to see and interact with. So I'm really excited to hear more about your expertise and the arguments that you bring.
Very good. It's always good to hear that people read the book and that it had some impact. That's always what you're hoping as an author.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely did. But before we get to that, I would just love to hear about your journey. How did you get into molecular biology and what was that journey like?
I actually started in my undergraduate studies in chemical engineering and saw myself at the age of 18 as being an engineer. I got a few years into that and was uh, fairly sure, well, I'm fairly sure that I didn't want to do chemical engineering, but I did want to do graduate school. So I went to grad school, moved to biochemical engineering, and became more and more interested in molecular biology. But it's really kind of a God thing because also in my undergrad years, I became more and more interested in apologetics. I had not been raised in a Christian home. We had all come to faith in my teen years. So after years and years and years of my family not going to church, suddenly we started going to church. We were all baptized within a space of a month of each other. And 4 years later, I was at Berkeley studying chemical engineering, but also recognizing for the first time a clash of worldview between my new Christian worldview and this worldview that was so evidently non-Christian,
Hmm.
which was the teaching perspective of nearly all the professors at a place like UC Berkeley. And there was an occasion where a chemistry professor used a lecture on the second law of thermodynamics to ridicule arguments for the existence of God or that God had created life based on the second law. And that didn't weaken my faith, but it stirred something in me where I felt like this person is abusing his authority
Hmm.
and has a bunch of 19-year-olds to a lecture theater full of 219-year-olds who see him as sort of an omniscient authority.
Hmm.
And I thought something has gone wrong here, and I would love to be a part of addressing things like this. And so that kind of led me to pray about apologetics, not knowing how the Lord would answer. It had that moment had kind of a key, and the way the Lord answered prayers following that moment had a key influence on my choice to go to grad school and what I ended up doing in grad school. I started to become interested in a critique of Darwinism and specifically molecular Darwinism, so
Hmm.
molecular genetics. Can Darwin's theory explain the origin of new genes? And that's what I felt called to as a grad student and sort of moved my PhD work in a direction that would set me up for that. Got married during my PhD work. The two of us went off, my wife and I went off to Cambridge University for postdoc. And that's where I started to sort of, that was the deep dive into molecular biology. Becoming a molecular biologist was in Cambridge. But it was for
Awesome.
a reason. It was for apologetics.
Hmm. That's super cool. I'm really excited to dive into the conversation, talk more about Darwinism and some critiques that you have. Even going to a Christian school, I just finished my bachelor's and it's in anthropology. So, uh, topic of Darwinism comes up a lot, and there are a lot of assumptions. And coming from a Christian worldview, there are definitely some conflicts, some ideas, and some questions and concerns that come up. But I just never came to a point where I was convinced. I was just always unconvinced by the evidence I would hear on YouTube of proponents arguing for it. So I'm excited to talk about your concerns and what your research has shown in your experiments. But to open up that box to some of our viewers who might not be familiar, what are we talking about when we're talking about Darwin's theory and the Darwinian mechanism?
Yeah, so Darwin, Charles Darwin wrote or published his book on the origin of species in 1859. It's a long book. I haven't read it in full. I got bored after 150 pages. It's really quite good in parts, but it's a long read.
Hmm,
Um, he was he wasn't the first one to think of this, but he was putting forward in the most robust way for the first time a case that nature can accomplish something like what humans accomplish when we breed domesticated animals, when we breed
hmm,
dogs, when we breed chickens and cows, the things that we want to get sort of a refinement of a species that accomplishes something for us.
hmm,
So if you think of dogs and all the different roles that we have, working dogs, you have the ones that pull sleds, you have the ones that um, track, you have the ones that herd, you have the ones that hunters use for pointing and for retrieving.
hmm,
Um, and there's probably some I've forgotten here, but all these are distinct roles. And we know that all of these dogs were bred from original kind of wild dog breeds that would have looked more like coyote and wolf and dingo. So these are the wild dogs you find out in the wild untamed today. And none of those are like all the different specialties that I just named. So it is true that for certain species, humans have been able to cultivate and selectively breed and pull out very, very particular properties when they do that. And it's not true of just dogs. There's birds that we've done this to, all kinds of, uh, of plants for our agriculture and farming. The current version that we have and that we farm is quite different, noticeably different from what a wild version would look like. And so Darwin, noticing this, and with some sort of philosophical stuff that came out of his own life, he did this voyage on the Beagle. Um, he was struggling probably spiritually in several ways. He lost a daughter at one point in his life
hmm,
as a child, which was very hard on him. He was putting together a case that nature itself could accomplish something like what humans had accomplished,
hmm,
not by deliberately trying to get a particular kind of dog, for example, but just by sifting variations that exist within a species, and the ones that are best suited to a particular environment would be favored over the ones that were less suited. And this was adaptation. And this whole process he called natural selection to distinguish it from human selection. And in a wild extrapolation, he convinced himself and tried to convince others that this could account for the diversification of all living things from some simple original life form. And he didn't in his On the Origin of Species book or in any other book attempt to explain that origin, the original
hmm,
origin of life. What he did was suggest that this natural version of selection could take any initial form of life and diversify it into a bunch of to occupy a bunch of different specialties, niches within the environment and create a huge diverse ecosystem that we see today.
hmm. So is it fair to say that the Darwinian mechanism, natural selection acts upon random mutation, depends on life and information to already exist, so it's something to mutate and select?
Yes, it definitely presupposes life. It presupposes living things that to some extent pass their attributes on to their offspring.
Hmm,
And it also presupposes that there's some possibility of variation in those properties being passed to their offspring.
hmm,
Humans had not discovered DNA or the role of genetics at the time of Darwin's writing, so he didn't know about genes. as we know of them today. He didn't know what the substance of heredity was, but he assumed there was this substance of heredity and that
Mm,
it could mutate or vary, and that it could vary in ways that were productive. And
mm,
really, of all the things that he put forward, natural selection is real, mutation is real, variation is
mhm,
real. The one thing that is the failing of the theory is the sorts of variation you get by natural mechanism do not allow one species to make this sort of magical migration and become something radically different.
mm.
That was storytelling. And all the science since Darwin's day has only confirmed that that was storytelling. Although the other thing that happened is his story became the leading story culturally among life scientists. So it has been the case for a long time now that you can't really get your credentials in the life sciences without signing up to, or at
Mm.
least giving lip service to Darwin's theory.
So it's more of a worldview thing than an actual
Yeah.
science already discovered type of thing. Is that fair to
There's
say?
lots of science around the periphery. So, population genetics is a math of
Mm,
how variations, how varying genotypes are distributed within populations and how that distribution changes with with changes in environment. And
mm,
that's all legitimate. And there's a lot of legitimate science that's done around the theory and very
mm,
aspects of the theory that are studied in detail and with legitimate science. But the
mm,
overall overarching story that everything you see in the biosphere can have been fashioned by something as simple as natural selection, that never gets critically examined because when you critically examine it, you see that it doesn't work. And that's
gotcha.
not what people want to acknowledge.
Gotcha. And that's why I hear proponents of Darwinism argue all the time that natural selection makes advances in life inevitable. It's not just that, oh, it could possibly happen, but they say it's inevitable that there will be all this change. But my question is, does natural selection actually have any inventive power? How does natural selection even operate on real life?
Well, if you just go back to the logic of natural selection, if you think about, selecting your lunch item off a menu, um, or selecting something off a dessert menu, the menu has to be there. So the options
Mm,
have to all be there, and you say, I'll have this one.
mm,
That is true for natural selection as well. The things have to already be there,
mm,
and to the extent that natural selection does anything, it is simply choosing something that's already there and letting the rest of it go by the wayside, not selecting the rest of it. So in that sense, it's not at all inventive. It doesn't make anything new come about. It simply eliminates some of what already exists.
mm,
And if you want to say that something amazing already existed, well, that's okay, but natural selection cannot have been the force that caused it to exist because it doesn't, natural selection does not bring things into existence.
mm.
Natural selection causes shifts in the composition of populations, which leads to extinction of certain genetic lines and proliferation of others, but it didn't invent those genetic lines. Those have to pre-exist.
Gotcha. So it's another thing that already relies on it. And
Right.
this is where I want to shift more and talk about your work, because you've done some very relevant experiments to this conversation. And in your book, you explained that biochemist Michael Denton argued that accidental processes would be incapable of finding new functional proteins if their amino acid sequences were rarer than one part in 10 to the 40th power. Now, my question is, what did you discover about the probability of these sequences through your own research and experiments? How does that relate to what he was arguing?
Yeah. So one of the things I was kind of chugging away with an idea of what I wanted to do when I was an independent scientist in various labs in the United Kingdom, in Cambridge. So one was in the Department of Chemistry at the University of Cambridge, and another was at the Medical Research Council Center in Cambridge, and then I ended up at a place called the Babraham Institute, also in Cambridge, on the outskirts of Cambridge. And I was aiming, and it took me various steps to get there, aiming to find out how much information there is in a single gene And by information, I mean how specific are the requirements for a gene to do its work. And so what I was aiming at that whole time, and I ended up with a paper that was published in 2004 at the end of my time there in Cambridge, that gave a probability, it gave a measurement and an estimate of how rare are the sorts of sequences that could be expected to fold into a
Mm,
functional protein that does something in a cell.
mm.
And the number that was reported in that paper is 1 in 10 to the 74th for a general folded protein, 1 in 10 to the 77th for is an estimate for the rarity of one that folds to a form that can solve a particular functional challenge, perform a particular function.
Wow. So it's much more unlikely than even the 10 to the 40th power that Michael Dent was talking about.
Yes. So 10 to the 40th, I, that paper, which was published in Journal of Molecular Biology in 2004, put forward 1 in 10 to the 77th, which is 37 orders of magnitude beyond the threshold that Michael Denton put forward of 1 in 10 to the 40th.
Wow.
So it's hard to imagine numbers like this, but
Yeah.
1 in 10 to the 77th is like 1 in 100,000 trillion, 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 trillion. Very improbable.
Yeah. And that's just for one new functional protein fold that can
Right.
accomplish a function you were talking about. So my question is, what amount of novelty in protein folds is necessary for new body plans and functions? Because that was just one. I'm assuming you need more than
Yeah.
one, right?
Really, there are very few functions in life that are kind of a standalone function that only require one functional protein. Almost everything
Mm,
that is, say, a new metabolic function, the ability to make an amino acid, the ability to um, import or export stuff to cells, the ability to signal between cells, scaffolding, proteins, almost all of these molecular motors require multiple proteins. Some of them require dozens of proteins with
mm,
different structures, and therefore the sort of problem that we're talking about here, the 1 in 10 to the 77th problem, give or take, would have to be solved many, many times simultaneously because you wouldn't get any benefit from having one chunk of this problem solved. You need to solve all 7 steps or 8 steps or 9 steps. So,
mm,
yes, it gets exponentially worse as you consider the actual complexity of living things.
mm. As you talk about whole systems, something that you bring up in your book is functional coherence. So, what is functional coherence, and why does it make invention fantastically improbable?
Yeah, I coined this term realizing that I was wondering whether there's something simple that's true about all things that function at a very high level. And by high level function, I mean um, things that perform something that is not at all performed by the stuff you'd find on Mars, the stuff
Mm,
you'd find on a lifeless planet. There you'll have minerals and you'll have energy. Some planets would have water, you have gases, you have phase changes, you have crystals, things like that. But none of those come close to doing what human inventions do, like smartphones and communication satellites and automobiles and rockets. The things that we invent use those minerals because your smartphone is made out of stuff that we got from Earth. It's all this mineral stuff that gets refined and purified and used to manufacture various components. And all those components are carefully designed to perform sub-functions
mm,
such that when you get all 10,000 of them or however many pieces are in your smartphone, all those sub-functions add up to the top level function, which is this needs to act like a smartphone. It needs to do the things of a smartphone. So there, if you think about it that way, there's a hierarchy of function every time you have an invention, a clever invention that's doing something that's wildly beyond what rocks and clouds do.
mm,
And that structure is a top level function supported by many sub-functions, each of those supported by many sub-functions, all the way down to elementary constituents. So there's a hierarchy of form, and this is a
mm,
very general thing for high-level function. It even works for say, an essay, if you have to write an essay like for your college uh, entrance application, and it's supposed to be like 1,000 word essay, you have your essay is the top level thing. You've got paragraphs within the essay that need to cohere and
Mm,
support that top level thing. You have sentences within each paragraph. You have words within each sentence, and you have letters that spell the word. So you have that same sort of hierarchy. And this is the general pattern that I put forward as being functional coherence.
mm,
What it means, what the two words mean is um, there are a bunch of pieces that are all functional, but they're not just off doing, random functions. All of these functions have to cohere in
mm,
order for them to line up and give you this top level function. So you could also think about it as an orchestra where you have many, many people playing many, many instruments, but they're not just off doing something random. It's not just a bunch of people randomly playing instruments. It all has to cohere if you want to get the top level thing
mm.
functioning together as an orchestra.
And I feel like connecting that to your previous point, where it's like for many functions, you need a lot more than just one new functional protein to go
Yes.
from one functionally coherent system to a new functionally coherent system. You probably need lots of functionally coherent changes there in the middle. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So if you wanted to bring something new, if you think in terms of animals and what makes animals so remarkable, what makes their body so remarkable, what are the th problems that they solve that are so interesting? And we could list tens of thousands if we had enough time. Something that's remarkable in the insect world is the compound eye, which is very
Mm,
different from our eyes. And you've seen these pictures, it's sort of space age looking, where they have little facets on their eyes, hundreds of facets. They don't see with the clarity that we see, but they see all around them, and they can have ability to see in wavelengths like infrared and ultraviolet that we can't see. So these are remarkable organs. Well, if you think about something that doesn't have a compound eye, like maybe a worm, it's not even an insect, what would have to happen in a worm for it to eventually give rise to something that has compound eyes? The
mm,
answer is a lot would have to happen. And um, we can examine and study, scientists can study compound eyes and look at all the parts of them and the aspects that make them work. And it would be aspects that go all the way down to the molecular level. So
mm,
there's development. So the a fertilized fly egg doesn't have compound eyes, but somehow in this seemingly miraculous process of development, you get a larval form and then you get an adult form that does have the compound eyes. All of those aspects of the compound eye, how it develops, how it's wired to the brain, you have to have a nervous system in order to use the compound eye,
mm.
and how it sees, how the facets form.
Wow.
All of these are brand new at some point if you want a compound eye to come into existence. And they're brand new because a Darwinist would say there was a time when there were no compound eyes. So these
Mm,
things had to get invented. And yes, functional coherence is relevant to the whole process because it does no good if we list 200 components of compound eyes or aspects of compound eyes. It does a worm no good to have three of those. You have to have the
mm.
whole thing. And you have to become something very different from a worm, by the way. I don't think a worm would
Yeah,
appreciate having compound eyes.
sure.
But the Darwinists would say there was something very simple, much, much simpler than any insect that gave rise to the insects. And at some point,
Mm,
compound eyes were very, very helpful. But there's no way that an accidental process can have produced them because of this
mm,
functional coherence. You have to have so many things going right in order for the top level function to be
mm.
performed.
So it seems to me that because of that, natural selection might actually be a limiting factor because until you land on new functional coherence, change is really going to leave only loss of functional coherence. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so that's a astute observation. If it were true that natural selection ruthlessly eliminates stuff that's not helpful, and the truth is you need to get a lot of not helpful stuff lined up before the last
Mm,
thing made the whole of it helpful, then natural selection is not the friend to this process because it's going to eliminate all this stuff along the way. So yes, that's true. Natural selection could actually make this worse.
mm,
Another way to think of this is there's a cost to carrying around genetic material that even if it is producing proteins that have a function, that fold and they have a function, if the function is not of benefit to the organism, there's a cost to making this stuff and to processing the genes. And
Hmm.
so colleagues of mine did a very clever experiment with bacteria where um, the bacteria were given an injured version of a gene
Hmm.
um, and allowed, if that gene were not injured, it would allow them to make one of the 20 amino acids that they need, tryptophan. But without the gene, they couldn't make this amino acid, and they had to be fed the amino acid in the
Hmm.
medium. Well, the expectation was there are just two breaks in this gene, and if these bacteria could evolve the way you would want to evolve, if you could think about evolution, you would repair in two steps. And the first step would give you a little bit
Hmm.
of restored function, and the second step would fully restore the function to make tryptophan. But what these cells did instead, time and time in these experiments that are reported in the literature, is they got rid of the gene altogether.
Hmm.
Why? Because it costs something to be maintaining and producing protein from a gene that's not doing you any good. And so
Hmm.
deletions came and removed it altogether.
Hmm.
And so that's an example of just what you said, Ash, where natural selection is working against what could have produced something productive because natural selection is not thinking about this. It's simply the fact that whatever helps you right now gets moved forward, and whatever doesn't help you or slightly hinders you often gets deleted and eliminated.
Hmm. So it seems that a Darwinist would either have to assume unlikely long time for all these things to line up, and you just explain why that you can't really expect that because it's going to get weeded out beforehand, or that there needs to be some sort of neutral mutation. Is that fair to say? Where they'd have to expect that all of these mutations are neutral, so they might not be eliminated. But it seems like that's unlikely from what you're saying, that any mutation would be neutral.
There are mutations that are they're sometimes called nearly neutral because it's hard to
Mm,
show mathematically that their effect
sure.
is exactly zero. We know of lots of mutations that have very, very little effect.
Mm,
The question is, can you build something new only with mutations that have very
mm,
little effect? And the experiment that I just alluded to shows you why you really can't expect to do that. Because at some point, if you're ever going to get a new gene that is doing something new, and as we've already said, you'd probably need four or five of these doing
mm,
something new to actually benefit the cell. There's going to be a phase where you've got the new scratch gene that's not really ready to go, but we're working on it, and
mm,
maybe the two or three other scratch genes. Well, at that point, because you're still working on it and it's not actually benefiting the cell, it's not neutral. It's actually baggage. And
mm,
so natural selection says, get rid of that. It's not pulling its own weight.
mm,
I'm not going to allow anything that doesn't pull its own weight. So in that sense, it's hard to imagine a scenario where you get new genes doing new things through a process that's entirely neutral.
that
Even
makes
if you did,
sense.
though, if you do the math and say, even if it were entirely neutral,
Yeah.
the time required to experiment with these four genes and get them to do something is way beyond the experiment that could be done by life in 5 billion years.
Yeah. That makes sense. So something else that you bring up in your book, I want to share one of the other calculations you made. You explain that 10 to 20% of genes found in species are shown to be on their own unapproachable. It seems that this, alongside your other calculations about protein folds and attaining new function, seems to leave Darwin's theory kind of defeated, mathematically implausible. If that's the case, why are Darwin's ideas so prevalent?
Well, we mentioned this sort of cultural aspect to this. It is the case, and I've experienced it in my own career, and I wrote about it in Undeniable, that a critique of an idea that has become sort of the social or cultural bedrock of a field, even if it's baloney, just
Mm,
between you and me. So the idea that natural selection and random mutation can have created all of life from a simple starting form is just baloney, and you can show that
mm,
it's false. But most biologists don't care to critique it.
mm,
They care about getting their paycheck,
sure.
getting their next grant, getting their graduate students, um, getting promoted, getting
Mm,
their papers published. Those are the things that they care about. If it's going to cost them in those things that they care about in order to engage in a rationally credible way in a critique of Darwinism and maybe admit, okay, you're right, this thing is severely wanting.
mm,
My colleagues and I are going to go back and see if we can come up with an answer to these questions. If we can't, then we're done with Darwinism.
mm,
If that would cost to do that would cost you your career, there are very few
mm,
people who will do it.
sure.
And I was stepping in the direction of doing that, and it cost me my position,
Mm,
Medical Research Council, uh,
mm,
in Cambridge. And it wasn't because my boss was Sir Alan First, who was the head of the center where I worked.
mm,
It wasn't that he was a rabid Darwinist. I can't find anything that he wrote that was about, Darwinism. He didn't really
sure.
have a stake in that.
Mm,
It's that he didn't want the controversy when a bunch of people get all up in arms about a
sure.
critique of Darwinism to land on his center. And so that
Gotcha.
cost me my job back in
Mm.
2002.
Well, in bringing up this controversy, I'm kind of curious. Your experiments and findings and calculations have been released in mainstream journals, like I introduced in the introduction. I'm curious, how have those been responded to or interacted with by
Yeah,
Darwinists?
it's an interesting thing. When I was authoring the Journal of Molecular Biology paper that came out in 2004, I was very carefully wording it because I wanted to make the point with some strength, but I didn't want to be pugnacious. I didn't want to
Sure.
rub people the wrong way. And I was coming up with this number that's a scary number, 1 in 10 to the 77th. And I carefully crafted my discussion saying that this raises questions about the origin of new proteins.
Hmm.
It went through peer review. Um, a top-notch editor handled the peer review, top-notch people performed were the peer reviewers. It got published in 2004.
Hmm.
I was thinking sort of naively that when this comes out, this is going to be a domino that gets knocked over that knocks over all the other dominoes. And that just didn't turn out to be the case.
Hmm.
What happens, even though the result should have caused everyone to, it's not just my result, but that result
Hmm.
combined with others should make people stand back and say, wait, there's something seriously wrong with this theory.
Hmm.
But they don't. And they don't because science is a very imperfect process. It's a very human process. It's one of the things I talk about in my book.
Hmm.
Um, and as we just said, if I care about my position, my um, my authority in my
Hmm.
field, the way I'm seen by my peers, getting grant money, getting papers published,
Hmm.
uh, and getting a paycheck, um, then I maybe don't. And if I consider all those to be jeopardized by me becoming a combatant or becoming someone who is critiquing something
Sure.
that's considered to be just a non-negotiable of my field, then I'm not going to critique it. I'll just toe the party line. That's what the vast majority of people do. And the few who don't often are visibly punished for
Hmm.
not doing that. And that just all the more makes people not uh, make waves over something like this.
Yeah. So all that to say that your calculations and experiments are still standing. I remember you talked
Yes.
to Sean McDowell and you had mentioned that a couple people had tried going after it, but they really weren't
Yeah.
able to demonstrate any problems with it. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
there's now early on there was a guy named Art Hunt who wrote something that came out on a blog called The Panda's Thumb. And he actually reached out to me and I dialogued with him a little bit. He didn't understand in his first crafting of the article that he sent to me, he misunderstood aspects of
Hmm.
the paper, and I tried to correct those. He still misunderstood, and the version that went up on Panda's Thumb shortly after the paper came out, I think in 2004. The thing is, so there is, and this gets recycled, and I hear about it 21 years later. People will cite this thing as if it's the takedown of a 2004 article that was peer reviewed and
Hmm.
published in the Journal of Molecular Biology. Pandas Thumb blog, Journal of Molecular Biology, no peer review. Peer review. A guy who doesn't even know the field. Art
Sure.
Hunt, he's a plant biologist, he's not even in the field that I authored the paper in, versus someone who is in the field. So they don't compare. It's a critique that's not at the level of the original work. Um, there was, I mentioned this in another blog, there was someone who attempted an article to severely critique the 2004 JMB article, and this was submitted to Journal of Theoretical Biology,
Mm,
and the editor, because it was specifically aimed at my work, the editor wisely chose for me to be one of several peer reviewers.
mm,
And this was a philosopher who was trying to critique a molecular biology paper, which is a tall order. And I said, good on you for attempting this, but you're not, the way you're using the terms shows that you don't understand, you're
mm,
not aware of how these terms are being used. And I thought it would be rejected, but 2 months later, I got a revised version. And this time there was a biologist who had been added
mm,
as one of the authors to the philosopher. And I thought, well, probably they're going to publish this. So I'm going to tell it still was incorrect. And so I said, here are the five critical problems with this work. One, two, three, four, five. And I thought, and I wanted to have it in simple bullet point form because I thought
sure.
they're going to publish this and I want to publish what my peer review said. Here's what I
Mm,
told them. And they didn't. The editor rejected the paper and
mm.
informed me of that. So
Wow.
that's a case where um, peer review did what it's supposed to do. I don't have the power. Some people think that a reviewer has the power to reject a paper. You don't. All you're
Mm,
doing is commenting on the paper. And
gotcha.
I knew it's not up to me whether this manuscript gets published or not, but I thought I'm going to give, as the one who's the author of the paper being called into question here, I'm going to give my assessment of why this does not cut it. And the editor agreed that I was right and rejected the paper.
Mm. So yeah, your experiments are still standing, pretty much unchallenged.
Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
been other work. The late Dan Tofik, his group at the Weizmann Institute in Israel has done more work and did more work after mine on beta lactamase, and it largely confirms the result that I got. So I think there's a crystallized consensus that was
Hmm.
not there in 2004 that I think is there now, that um, the sort of amino acid sequence required to fold into a native-like structure and perform a function like the functions we see done in cells, performed in
Hmm.
cells, is a very, very rare amino acid sequence.
Hmm.
The vast majority, if you just string together amino acids, will not do that. They will they will not fold. They'll get chewed up within cells by proteases and recycled.
Well, I think that's pretty groundbreaking. It had me convinced. Not that I'm at all the hardest person convinced on this subject, but I even know Christians who hold the view of common ancestry and are sold into that. But my question is, why do you think that is? That's the topic of theistic evolution. My question is, if Darwin's theory is poorly supported, and if there are these problems, such as your experiments that you presented, why do you think some Christians have adopted it? Could there even be some amount of contradiction between saying a purposeful creator used a random process to bring about diversity in life?
Yeah, I think there is that. I would say contradiction. At the very least, I think you have to admit there's tension there. People say, well, this could be the means by which God created, but all these astonishing, it seems to me you're robbing a portion of his creation of the glory that he's glorifying himself through how he's done things. And random mutation and natural selection is not a very glorious way to do things.
Sure.
So I think it does rob the creator of glory.
Mm,
Now, another question is, well, there's lots of other doctrinal things like what happens to humanity if humanity is something that could have been anything and it just
mhm,
got cobbled together by accidental processes. What does that mean for the incarnation? Because
mm,
the second person of the Godhead steps into creation. Through him, all of this was created, and then he steps into it and becomes one of
mm,
us. How could that be something that's left to chance
mm,
um, and is highly contingent? And the whole question of the fall. What does it mean for the fall to happen if we're just evolved apes? I mean,
Mm.
was there an Adam and Eve? So all of these things. I have had a good conversation with a guy named Cy Gart. I don't know if you saw that was on Sean McDowell's podcast, came
Okay.
out recently. He's sort of in the theistic evolution camp, but he's
Gotcha.
but he's also very friendly toward intelligent design. At least
Hmm.
he infers intelligent design when it comes to the origin of life, but then he's okay with Darwinism when it comes to the diversification of life.
Gotcha.
And I think there are doctrinal problems there,
Hmm.
that you cannot, there are crucial things about doctrine that get very messed up once you go down that direction. I had a productive conversation with Cy, and I think he's very open-minded about it. But one of the things that he told me that I didn't know
Hmm.
is in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of shift in the theistic evolution camp. I
Hmm.
haven't been following it closely. I bump into it every now and then. And I think some of the things that they were saying that were kind of not being well accepted by evangelicals, they've backed off of. So you
Hmm.
don't hear anymore. There was a point where they were going after Adam and Eve, and I think
Hmm.
you don't see them going after Adam and Eve
Sure.
anymore. And I think there are a lot of things that they were being kind of strident about or forceful about that I think they've changed. There's also probably been recognition that anytime you call something a camp, you probably don't call it a camp, but if you say we're the theistic evolutionists and you get everyone together in a big room, you'll find that there's a bunch of different ideas being
Sure.
represented
That's
there.
fair.
And do you are the disagreements there significant enough that some people say, well, I don't actually want to be a part of this?
Sure.
Or do you say, well, let's just stick together for this one sort of mission that we can have as a common mission?
Hmm.
You could call my colleague Michael Behe a theistic evolutionist in that has he stated that he affirms common ancestry. So he would accept that humans and mushrooms, at least he said this, have a common ancestor, the tree of life.
Hmm.
But he says it can't have happened the way the Darwinists say it happened. It had to have
Gotcha.
happened by God, inputting information and guiding it
Purposely
along
doing
the
it
way.
over history.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I
That
still
makes sense.
think that leaves you with problems
Sure.
particularly with humanity, but
Yeah.
at least um,
At least it's still
he's
purposeful.
recognizing that accidental causes cannot conceivably
Sure.
have done what had to be done.
That's fair. Like I said at the beginning, I've just been unconvinced and underwhelmed by the arguments I've heard for common ancestry from the fossil record and from genetics. And it seems to me a lot of it just relies on similarities in anatomy, function, genetic code, not necessarily all at the same time in the same organisms. But I think even assuming similarity, isn't it just as fair to say that that could be evidence of a common designer, especially if these designs are too distant to be connected ancestrally? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so humans do this all the time. If there's something that we have that works, um, you don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, that's our slogan. I mean, so a wheel works. If I've got another application and I need something to roll, well, I'm going to use a wheel. It's
Hmm.
not that that original whatever it was, chariot, uh, got evolved into a skateboard. It didn't. It's that the idea that was implemented in the chariot is relevant to the concept that is trying to be refined when you invent a skateboard or try to improve a skateboard. So humans do this all the time. You take something that works, that's clever, you retask it, you reapply it in lots and lots of different ways. And
Hmm.
that's a hallmark of human engineering and human invention. So, and I'm not comparing, in some ways, divine invention is going to look very different from
Sure.
human invention. But here, and it might look very different. It's not like God saying, "Oh, what can I?" He's never going to be rubbing his hands thinking, "How can I solve this problem?" Because he doesn't need to rub his hands together. He's omniscient. But
Hmm.
might it look to God more like, "This is a beautiful thing,
Hmm.
and I've applied this beautiful thing here, and it's so beautiful, I want to apply it here and here and here." And
Hmm.
that looks very different from common ancestry.
Hmm.
So if we go back to we were talking about culture in the sciences and your question about theistic evolution generally. I don't want to put words in
Sure.
anyone's mouth. So whoever refers to himself or herself as a theistic evolution, I think we need to give them the
Mm,
courtesy of explaining how they land on that. And
sure.
there's no one answer. But I think one factor that comes into play is this cultural pressure that
Mm,
um, if you're a scientist,
mm,
you will take heat even today for parting ways with Darwinism.
mm.
And so if you're a believer and a scientist, you have to be prepared to take that heat, or you zip your lips and don't say anything
Sure.
about it, um,
Yeah.
or you come out with something that will reduce the heat that you take.
Mm,
But then you're taking some heat probably at church. So I've had conversations with people they're a believer, they're a scientist, and you can imagine you're in this place where I'm in two cultures. I'm in a science culture and
mm,
I'm in a church culture, and they have their different ways of thinking about things. And I'm just trying to live my life. You can imagine that for some people, you try to find a compromise where if I become a theistic evolutionist, I can assure my Christian friends
mm,
that I believe in creation. In fact, they changed the name to evolutionary creationist
mm.
to try to brand it for
Yeah.
the church. That doesn't help them with their science friends to call
Sure.
themselves evolutionary creationists. But you can see how there's a very human problem here, and I'm laughing, but I'm not minimizing the difficulty of
Right.
walking in a way that is in touch with two different cultures and trying to straddle it. That does have complexity to it.
Yeah.
I think we're called ultimately as believers to stand with the truth and not be too concerned about what people think about us,
Mm,
particularly if I am accepting something as true that is apparently true and is taught by Scripture. I got to be willing to take some heat for that.
mm. That's a good word. And we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question. Really, something that stood out to me from your book and getting to hear you present on it was just this aspect of beauty that you mentioned in
Yeah.
life and in creation. And something that I really took from your book and impacted me just the way I walk around and look around at the things around me is just the realization that if the greatest conceivable mind created life on this planet, we'd expect its design to be far superior than anything we've created. We might also expect to display more than just exquisite engineering, and it's been cool hearing the engineering side and how your background comes into that, but also art and patterns and
Yeah,
stories. Is that what we find in life?
absolutely. So this is one of the favorite parts for me about teaching. I've made a course that's called The Design of Life that I teach
Mm,
here at Biola. I teach an upper division version to biology students, but I teach a lower division to non-science majors. And some of the early part of the course is about making the design argument. Most of the course is about showing how different
mm,
life is from anything that humans have designed, and it's gloriously different. There's this um, there's this just overabundance of beauty and extravagance in how God has designed things. He didn't have to make a million beetle species, but he did.
mm,
And they're actually beautiful. Even some of the destructive ones that you don't want, they can be pests, but they're beautiful with their iridescent shells. You look at any corner of life, you're going to find things that are extraordinary.
mm,
And the way life operates is extraordinary. I show my students that um, God is not just the supreme engineer and the supreme artist, he's a master storyteller. So you can
mm,
expect there to be stories that are being told through how he's created life. And all of this is missed if you think that life just happened by accident. You have to first accept that no, a personal creator God put us here on this remarkable planet, surrounded by all this beauty. Wouldn't he have done some things to show us something, to show something of
mm,
himself?
mm. That's awesome. When you talk about how he's poured himself into the world, we can see that beauty. And I love your challenge for all of us, even those who don't have a science background, to just go take a walk, enjoy it. Like that's worshipful to God, and He
For
enjoys
sure.
when we take interest in His work. So I definitely want to recommend all our listeners to go and check out his book, Undeniable. Is there anywhere else they can find any of your resources, your articles, even figure out what you're doing at Biola? So if they're wanting to go into the science route, they can hear about
Well,
that.
you can find me at the Biola website. I'm also soon going to be spinning up a douglasaxe.com, but it's not there yet. So I don't
Okay.
want I'm getting some help from people who know how to do that better than I know how to do it. I am sort of reluctantly have some association with social media. I have a love-hate relationship with it. So I was on Twitter, so now X, so that's Doug at Doug Axe. Um, but also the Biola website and this my own website will be coming up soon. I think this
Awesome.
fall is when that will appear.
Very cool. Well, definitely want to encourage you guys to go do that, but also just take this conversation and let it shape the way you view God, the world He's made, and may just give you a response of worship, just at His greatness and how we get to walk around and enjoy it. So, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.